All right. Hi, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Hello, namaste, good morning. And so good to see so many of you joining in from different parts of the world. Hi, Ravi. Hi, Vaidehi. I'm just saying a few names here. Let us know if you can see us and hear us properly with us today. We have a very special guest joining us to tell us something which you all are very, very interested in and have expressed a lot of interest in the previous sessions and the questions you've asked us. So here we are on another session of Insights with Upgrad. And with us, we have Nishant Goyal today, who's going to talk about deconstructing big tech. We promised that we'll be talking about a case study on Facebook, but Nishant said, hey, why just restrict our audience till that point? We'll give them Facebook, Twitter, and one more, right? Nishant, we talked about
Netflix.
and Netflix. Oh my God! So that's like a bonanza for all of you guys joining in today. So we're talking about three different amazing organizations deconstructing their tech, and definitely feel free to ask questions once Nishant covers what he has to cover in today's session. Do keep your questions on the Q&A box. For any issues with audio and video, do keep it on the chat box. I'll be picking up questions from the Q&A box. So, all right, before I hand it over to Nishant, very quickly want to understand from you what's your work experience like and what is the outcome you're expecting from today's session. All right, I want to see more people vote. Help us understand your work experience so that Nishant can be, oh, do I have to explain each term in so much detail? Or can I just skip over some parts? And tell us what your outcome is that you're expecting from today's session so that we can pick those questions up in more detail when the Q&A time comes. Okay, about 30% of you voted, waiting for the others to very quickly press two keys. All right, I think so far less than 9 years, Nishant, for us. And they want to understand if they can build a career in this field and how it's shaping the industry, which you definitely are going to tell us. Uh, all right, still waiting for some more of you to very quickly help us so that we just close this poll and hand it over to Nishant from here. Okay, so I think we have enough data to begin. Nishant, about 70% people have voted. We've got a young audience today. A lot of them are in the 0 to 2 years experience, as you were sort of anticipating before the session started. And they want to know how they can build their career and how it has shaped the industry. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Medha, and it's really feels great. First of all, to discuss about all these things because these are the things which make me very excited when I talk about these things. And secondly, because audience seems really excited to know a bit about it. So let's get started. So before that, I'll just give a 1 minute introduction. So I'm Nishant Goyal. I graduated from IIT Mandi in 2013. I've worked with big tech companies like Cisco, Amazon, and I'm currently working with Microsoft. That was my introduction. And today, now let's share my screen. Let's get to the topic straight away. Just a second.
Well, happy Engineers Day to you, Nishant, and to all the engineers attending the session today.
Yeah, and that makes this even more auspicious day, to have this webinar. Okay, let's get started. As you can see, as Medha told that, we have thrown in some more big techs for you over here, which is Netflix, Twitter. First thing which I wanted to talk to the audience is that, why are we doing this webinar? Why are we not just discussing about how to get a job or, how to prepare yourselves to get a job in this industry? But why are we discussing this particular topic. So that is something which I want to talk, so that the agenda is clear, the expectations are clear. So basically, whenever we talk about uh, you know preparing ourselves for a full stack development role, or becoming a full stack developer, we are really thinking about languages like C++, Java, Python, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, or we are thinking about frameworks like Django, Node.js, AngularJS, React.js, things like that. Or we are talking about algorithms or data structures, some basic algorithms and data structures which help us to crack the interview and things like that. So our whole life is revolving around these things, and often we keep we lose the track of what it will be once we become a full stack developer, especially in a product based company or in a big tech company. How or why the life of an engineer is so interesting. I know that a lot of people won't agree with it. That's interesting, but believe me, once we start solving problems for people, once we start solving problems for masses, then it becomes then it no more remains about HTML and CSS, or backend or front end or databases. It becomes a problem which has to be solved through common sense, and how people in the industry so far have done that for such big organizations. All right, so that is the agenda. The agenda is to intrigue you more into what you're signing up for when you say that you want to become a full stack developer, or you are kind of a fresher, or young to full stack development, and you want to elevate your career. So basically, what is it that you'll be doing on a day-to-day basis? What are the kind of problems you'll be hearing about, solving about? So those are the things, that is the kind of agenda that we thought about from this particular webinar. That is something we want you to take back and appreciate, a lot of things which we don't even think about when we use such big tech like, Netflix or Facebook or Twitter, right? So let's go ahead with the first thing that we have in our mind, which is Netflix. So basically, everyone is aware about Netflix. Uh, I don't think there is anyone who would not have seen a movie or some series on Netflix or something like that. But we don't think too much about what happens when we press a play button on a particular movie or a series, and we just start seeing the video right away, right? How is it that it is so fast? What all things are going on in the background? What all different titles that we see on day-to-day basis, how are those being selected for us? So there are a lot of things which we don't really think about, and which falls into the category of a full stack developer, because a full stack developer is someone from where the solution to a problem starts originating, and then it grows into an ML problem, or a big data problem, or a database problem, or a data science problem. So basically, it's the full stack developer who first comes up with a plan, who lays down the groundwork for anything. And it's a full stack developer who often goes ahead and solves problems into big data or AI, ML, or things like that. That is how it goes on in the industry. Okay, so so why are we discussing about Netflix, right? So let's take a look at some of the statistics first, like why discussing Netflix is important from a technical point of view. Okay, so the first thing over here, so the first thing over here that we see is that there are 200 million paid subscribers and 300 million viewers altogether, which Netflix boasts about. Okay, 200 million paid subscribers is a huge, huge, huge thing. Okay, so that is the first thing why we want to discuss Netflix. That how are they streaming the video at such a big scale? Okay, let me give you one more stat about scale. Yeah, this is another stat which tells more about the scale of Netflix, which is 6 billion hours of Netflix per month is being watched globally. Okay, you just think about 6 billion hours, on an average. Okay, so this is really, really huge. That means just think about the amount of time we are spending on Netflix, and how is it that Netflix is able to support all of that for all of us. Okay, then the second thing is that 80% of what we watch, it comes from recommendation. Okay, it does not come from, like, the rest 20% comes from, we really have a title in our mind, or we saw some YouTube trailer of something and we now go to Netflix and watch it. But 80% of what we watch comes from recommendations. So just think about how well the recommendation engine of Netflix has been built. Let me throw another stat at you. 40% of internet downstream traffic comes from Netflix during peak hours, and this is the data from US. Okay, do you understand 40% of internet downstream traffic? What does that mean? So basically, the entire internet traffic, it is divided into two things, which is an upstream traffic when you upload something, and a downstream traffic when you download something. So when you are viewing a video, you are essentially downloading that video, right? So the overall downstream traffic that we have in US, 40% of it is being occupied by Netflix and Netflix alone. Just think how important Netflix is for internet. Okay, if Netflix is not there, 40% of the traffic over the internet will be reduced. Okay, overall globally, that number comes to 15%, which is again a very huge thing. 15% of global application traffic is coming from Netflix. Okay, so these are some of the things why we want to discuss about Netflix. The last thing which I want to share over here is Netflix is supported across 2200 different kind of devices. Okay, and this last fact is not a very new fact, not a very recent fact. Okay, because I can't get the latest figures on this particular thing, but a few years down the lane, Netflix was already supporting 2200 devices where you can watch Netflix on your iPhone, on your iPad, on various kinds of Android devices, on your Android TV, on your Fire Stick, whatever it be. And whenever you watch Netflix on one of the device, it is very much curtailed to that particular device. Okay, so just think about how much engineering they are doing behind the scenes, so that when you watch it on an iPhone, the experience is such that it caters to the iPhone viewing experience. When you watch it on an Android, the experience is such that it caters to an Android device. When you watch it on a big screen, the experience is such that it caters to that big screen, and you don't notice any thing like on your iPhone it was working really good, the video quality was good, but when you switch to a big screen, the video quality went down. You don't search any such thing, you don't feel any such thing. Okay, so these are some of the stats about Netflix. And now let's take a look at how what is really happening behind the scenes for Netflix. All right, let's I was short of better terms, I'm calling it features. All right. So let's discuss on the first feature, which is availability and reliability. Okay, so all the lities that you hear about, right, about availability, reliability, all these kind of things, scalability. So these are really, really important when you are building something where millions of people are watching it or millions of people are using it. Okay, because just think about it, like in 2008 this happened with Netflix. It was down for 3 days. All right, 3 days it was down, and it was a big fuss everywhere that we can't watch Netflix. Now we never hear about Netflix going down, even for a second. Okay, we never hear about Netflix some of the titles not working, or video not getting streamed properly. That is what the reliability aspect of it is. And Netflix has achieved 99.999% availability and reliability. That's what Netflix claims. Okay, 99.999%, that's 5 nines in it. Okay, so basically Netflix has worked really, really hard to achieve this number. And how it has been able to do it is through uh, deploying everything on cloud, first of all, and secondly, using CDN networks very, very effectively. Okay, we'll come to CDN in a bit, what CDN is and what really happens. And then, let's talk more about cloud. So basically, Netflix was on its own data centers, and this fiasco happened, as I told you, in 2008, where it was down for 3 days. That's when Netflix realized that, it's not, we are not into business of building data centers, we are into business of streaming video. Okay, and that's when they realized that we should not be wasting our engineering efforts into running that data center, or creating infrastructure for the data center. Let's leave it to people who do that very effectively, which is the cloud partners that we have today, like Amazon, AWS, or Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud Services, things like that. Okay, so first thing is that they shifted to cloud. The other thing is that they are very, very fault tolerant. Okay, whenever you see Netflix, it's coming from a particular, that video, or all the titles that you see, the screen that you see on the Netflix, it's being streamed, or it's been coming from one particular region. But as soon as that region fails down, it goes down. We don't even see anything, or we don't even realize that a region might have went down in the background, and now we are getting data from some other region now. Okay, so that is how Netflix has built its fault tolerance, which is by replicating or by serving one particular customer from 3 regions at least. Okay, so, and you'll say that it won't go down that often, that's why we would not have noticed that Netflix is down in one particular region. But that's not the case. Netflix goes down once per week. Okay, once per week it goes down every time in a particular region, and it's really hard to miss if we if that was visible to all of us. Okay, so you'll ask that what is the engineering then, that it's going down once per week. Then what is it that they have done really? Basically, why it goes down once per week? Because that's the Netflix doing it on purpose, because they want to keep on testing that is their fault tolerance working? What they claim about region independence, is that working? When one region goes down, how seamlessly a user gets transferred to another region and does not even realize it? Is that working or not? Okay, so that is a bit about scalability, availability and reliability. uh, the next thing that I want to really talk about is big data processing and analytics. Okay, big data, simply means that it's a lot of data. All right, that's what big data means. It's not like it's a very, very big data. It's that it's a lot of data to consume, and when once we are faced with this lot of data problem, how we solve those problems is a bit different than how we solve it for a database. Okay, so that's why we coined this term big data, and that is why there is a separate engineering branch for big data. All right, so Netflix collects a lot of information. Netflix knows what everyone has watched. Okay, that's the first thing. Obviously they'll know what everyone has watched. They also know when they watched it, and they also know that where they were when they watched it. Okay, so basically when you play a title or a movie, you stop it in between, you switch off your television, you come back and you again start that movie, it will play right from where you left it, right? So Netflix knows all this information. All this information, all this data is being flowing into Netflix systems every second. Okay, Netflix also knows which videos members have looked at but decided not to watch. Okay, that's a negative use case. All right, where you looked at a title, you maybe saw the trailer, you went into it, you looked into its info, but you decided not to watch, and that is also really, really important. Okay, Netflix also knows how many times each video has been watched and a lot more. Okay, I can keep on going about on and on about what all Netflix knows, and but these are some of the things. All right, so when you have so much data flowing into your systems, you have to process that data, you have to bring that data into a standard format, and that is what big data engineering is all about. And then once you have the data in some standard format, you have to make sense of that data. And that is what analytics is all about. Okay. Because analytics is there to answer specific questions, and we'll see later on how those questions are being answered with all of that data. Let's come to another point, which is personalization. Okay. uh, so one very good example of personalization is that for any particular title, and there was a news article on this like a few weeks back, where people were discussing about Stranger Things. Like Stranger Things is a series, for those who don't know, on Netflix, and a lot of people were seeing different header images for that particular series. So header images is that big image that you see for a particular title, whenever you see any title on Netflix, okay, that big image that you see. And it's not consistent for users. Okay, so basically one user will see one image, another user will see another image, uh, so on and so forth. So this header image is basically meant to intrigue you, to draw you into selecting a video. Okay. uh, so basically, then how is that, some people are seeing some other header image versus some people are seeing some other header image, right? What is this thing? All right. So basically, this is where personalization comes into picture. Okay, first very basic thing that they can do is that, which is that header image where they see a very good conversion rate. That is, one header image we saw, like 1,000 users watched this particular header image, and out of that 600 actually watched the series after looking at that header image, versus another header image where 1,000 people saw it but only 10 people actually saw the series. So this is the very basic thing that they can do. And but still it tells us about how data driven Netflix is, right? But how can you do even better than that is at personalization at each user level. And that is the level which Netflix, at which Netflix personalizes everything for you. This is one of the examples which I'm giving you. All right. So Netflix personalizes all the image that they show you at a user level. And what is that user level? So basically, let's say there is some cast in that, in one of the header image, which for whom you have watched a lot of movies in the past. Or let's say, there is a header image which is conveying a happy emotion versus a header image which might be conveying a thriller emotion, things like that, various different genres, right? And uh, this particular user, which genre intrigues or is interesting for this particular user, let's show that header image. Okay. So this personalization at a user level is really, really hard to achieve. Just think about it, how much data, has to be basically, first of all, ingested into Netflix, then being processed and analyzed, and then finally reached at a conclusion at a user level, not, at a country level or a state level or a city level, but at a user level. All right. And this is one of the examples of, personalization. uh, the next thing which comes up is the recommendation, as we were talking earlier, that 80% of the titles or the videos that we see on Netflix are being recommended. They were being recommended to us, and that's why we saw them. All right. But when we go to a Netflix screen, we only see some 40 to 50 video options in general, right? But they have thousands of videos available. So how does Netflix decide this at a per user level? Again comes user personalization, which leads to better recommendations. And this is achieved obviously using machine learning. All right. So basically, whatever we talked about big data processing and analytics just a few moments before, so that is what is making all of this happen. That is what is making the recommendation so successful. That is what is fueling the recommendation engine. Okay. So Netflix look at this data and predicts what you will like. Okay. So this prediction algorithm is really, really cool from Netflix. Okay. Everything you see on Netflix was chosen specifically for you. Okay. It was not chosen for your country. It is chosen at country level also. It is chosen based on geographies also, but it is also chosen specifically for you using machine learning. Okay. The next thing which I want to talk about is encoding. So like, we were discussing about how Netflix is being supported on 2200 types of devices. Okay. So basically Netflix creates separate videos or 2200 kinds of videos for each particular device. Okay, and when you do that, this process so in this process the video goes on through something known as encoding. All right, and that is something which makes Netflix so awesome to watch on any particular device. You can see the difference when you watch Netflix versus when you watch some other video streaming service. All right, where you see that something is working on my phone but it's not working on the television or things like that. All right, or the video quality got affected. All right, so this is something which is known as encoding, and Netflix goes around really takes a lot of pain to actually make it a very good viewing experience across all the devices for one single video. Okay, and that's just about video. Think about the audio files, right? Think about the subtitles, right? That's a text file at the end of the day, right? So that is something about encoding. Now the last thing which I want to talk about is video streaming, right? The how do we how is it possible that we click on a title? So till now whatever we discussed was happening before we clicked on a title to watch it. Okay, whatever we were discussing was based on that, but now we get to the main part, which is CDN, as I told you earlier, right? Where the actual streaming happens when you click on a title and you start watching a title. Okay, CDN stands for Content Distribution Network. In a very layman term, it's nothing but a lot of machines spread across throughout the world, a lot of computers spread throughout the world. Okay, and when a user wants to watch a video, the nearest computer to that particular user is being located, and the video starts streaming from that nearest location. Okay, and the biggest benefits that Netflix gets out of the CDN system is speed and reliability. Okay, so speed is obvious because we are choosing the nearest location, the nearest computer, or the nearest CDN node to where you are watching the video from. Okay, hence the latency is drastically reduced, and I'm talking about millisecond latencies here. I'm talking about 50 millisecond versus 200 milliseconds. So even if you're watching a video from US, from a node which is present in US, when you're streaming from a machine which is present in US, even then the turnaround time over the wire is 200 milliseconds. It's not even in seconds. Okay, but Netflix has taken it up upon itself to basically even reduce it further down to 50 millisecond, and that is something which you have to do when you are building a quality product. Okay. So that was a basic glimpse on I just want to talk about a few things about Netflix. Now let's jump into Facebook newsfeed. Okay, so we have observed we have been observing Facebook for like past 10-12 years. Like a lot of people have been using Facebook since 2009 is what I remember. And the most fun part about Facebook is the news feed that we see. All right. Basically, we see various different kinds of posts. We see images, we see videos, we see some text posts, from the people who are our friends or from pages which we are following. Okay, so I just want to go very quickly on how Facebook comes up, or how does Facebook constructs the feed for you. Okay, so one thing which I want to tell you is that whenever someone posts something on Facebook, and this is pertaining to only Facebook, whenever someone posts something, nothing really happens. All that happens is that you made a post and it got saved into some database somehow. Okay, the actual magic happens when your friend starts Facebook on his or her browser and starts scrolling through his or her news feed. Okay, the real magic happens at that point of time. And how does so basically what I'm trying to say is that the news feed, which is personal, or which is limited to every user, So the news feed for one user is different versus for other user it's different, right? Because one user has so and so friends, the other user has so and so friends. One user has followed so and so pages, the other user has followed so and so pages. So these two different users will see posts from these pages and the friends that they have, right? So basically, first very basic thing is that it's different for different users. Okay, the feed that you see. But the most interesting part over here is that as soon as you log into Facebook, you see that feed within a second. Okay, it's not like it's 10 seconds or 15 seconds or a minute. I mean, yeah, if your internet connection is very slow, then it takes some amount of time because all that feed is getting downloaded in your browser. Okay, but if your internet connection is fast enough, you see that within a second, you see your feed constructed. And what I'm telling you right now is that that feed gets constructed within that second. Okay, it's not constructed beforehand for you. It gets constructed within that second, because just think about it. If it was getting constructed beforehand, how will they take care of which posts have you already seen earlier versus now you want to see that? Okay, so basically all this magic happens within that 1 second. So just think about the scale of it. All right, and then let me pour in another fact on top of it, which is that when you see the feed, it's not in a chronological order that first this like 8 hours back this particular post was there, then 7 hours back this particular post came in, or in a reverse chronological order that this is the most recent post for you, your some particular friend posted this for you, or this is the other post which is not so recent, like 2 hours before, then 3 hours before, whatever it is. It's not in that fashion. Okay, there is a relevancy score attached to each post which you are supposed to see when you log into Facebook. All right, and let's try to deconstruct what this relevancy score is made up of. All right, so first thing that is being seen is that who posted it. Okay, what are your dynamics with that user? So let's say your brother posted it. Okay, and you interact a lot with your brother over Facebook, you like a lot of posts from your brother, uh, you comment a lot on your brother's post, versus some very distant friend posted it where you don't interact at all with that post. Okay, so that is one of the factor which contributes to who posted it. Similarly, when we talk about pages, the posts of let's say there is some musical page and you really interact a lot with that page, like with the post of that page, versus there is some maybe political page or a news page where you don't interact much with that page. All right, so that is what we mean by who posted it. Okay, the second thing is the type of content, like is it an image, is it a video, is it just plain text, how often do you interact with an image, how often do you interact with a video. And just keep in mind that I'm just talking about you, I'm just talking about one single user, I'm not talking about this in generalization. Okay, this news feed is being constructed for you. So who posted it means who matters to you. The type of content means the type of content that matters to you. All right, then the next thing which is being seen is the interactions on that post. So basically, let's say if you're viewing a post and it has got a lot of likes and a lot of comments, then obviously the relevancy score of that post has become very high, and that is the first thing that you'll see in the news feed. All right, so that is what we mean by interactions. The next thing is obviously recency. Okay, so what recency means is that how recent was this post. But so as I told you earlier that recency is not the only factor based on which the posts are aligned on your feed. Okay, but it is one of the factors. So basically, to give you an example, let's say you have your friend who posted some very important post. Maybe that friend got married or got engaged and he shared that post 3 days back, and versus your brother who shared some random post on a sandwich that he made just 1 hour back. So obviously the brother's post is the most recent post, and obviously the brother's post might be uh, more relevant to you because you interact a lot with your brother. But if the Facebook engineers are doing their job better, you will still see that post about engagement, which was really important, which is like kind of a life event in somebody's life. You'll still see that first in your feed, and then you'll see that sandwich later on. You are really, not caring about recency, not caring about who posted it, but the type of content there. All right. So that was one example. And that is how we reach at a relevance score for a post for a single user. Okay. So each post might have different relevance score for different users. Okay. So my brother posted something, it has a relevance score of maybe 1.5 for me, but for some other distant friend, it's like 0.7 or zero point 0.6 for him. All right. So that is what I'm saying, that for each single post, the relevance score is calculated per user. All right. And once that relevance score is there for all of the posts that have to be shown to this particular user, and how do we figure out all of the posts that have to be shown for this particular user? Using the Graph API. Like you might have heard of the Facebook Graph API, right? What does Graph API mean? That, what all friends, like who all friends posted for this particular person, or which all pages posted for this particular person whom this particular person follows, right? So for all these posts, we calculate the relevancy score, then it is being sorted based on the relevancy score, and that is how that is when you see that feed, and all of this magic happens in a second. Okay, just to make you realize how far Facebook is really going to construct that feed for you, so that it becomes so much interesting for you that you are glued to it. All right. Now let's discuss a bit about Twitter. So basically, we do there are not a lot of users to Twitter versus Facebook when we compare the users, but there is a lot of engineering happening on Twitter, because Twitter is all about real time. Okay, Twitter. So basically, we don't use Facebook to see if an earthquake happened in some part of the world. We don't use Facebook to see a particular news, but people do that to see. People use Twitter for that. Okay, so basically, like once I was in Delhi and it shaked and I felt a tremor of an earthquake. I didn't go to Facebook to see. I went to Twitter, because Twitter is all about real time, where real users are just posting that I also heard felt a tremor. Is someone else who felt a tremor? So what I'm trying to say is that why discussing Twitter is really, really important is because of its real time promise. Okay, and two very basic things that we do on Twitter is uh, we post a tweet on a Twitter, and we search for some things on the Twitter. I'll come to the search part later on. Let's discuss about what happens when we post a tweet on Twitter. Okay, so first thing is, obviously Twitter is not asynchronous in that way, where a dedicated connection is being created between your machine and the servers. Okay, because mostly people are using Twitter on mobile phones, and it's not possible over there. So basically, it's API based, the REST APIs, as you all might have heard of. And when you tweet, the API is being hit, and that particular tweet, first of all, is being saved somewhere. Okay, in some database, along with its, if there is some image or a video in that tweet, along with all other information, that how many likes or how many retweets have happened for this particular tweet, who is the user who posted this tweet, and a tweet ID is also being created for that particular tweet. Okay, and then the fan out happens. So it is in contrast to how Facebook was doing it. Okay, in case of Facebook, the timeline was getting constructed in real time, whereas Twitter, who has to really do it real time, keeps on constructing that timeline for you in the background. Okay, and that is what fan out means over here. What Twitter really does is that it figures out that, okay, this person has posted a tweet, who all are the people who actually follow this particular person, and whenever that those people who follow this person will come online or will check their Twitter timeline, they really want to see that tweet, right? uh, so it keeps on constructing timelines for users behind the scene every time. Okay, and that is what we call as a fan out. Okay, where one tweet gets fanned out into whatever different followers, whatever the number of followers for that particular user is. Just think about people like Lady Gaga, or who have millions of followers. Just think about the scale of fan out that is happening for one single tweet. Okay, and then it uses something called a cache, which is like a Redis database, which they were using earlier. I don't know what they're using today, but they were using Redis database like an year back. And basically Redis is a key value store, where key is the user ID of that particular user on Twitter, and value is the timeline for that particular user, that when that user comes online, when he checks his Twitter timeline, what is it that this particular user will see. All right. So that timeline is being saved into Redis. Okay. But what is more important over here is that uh, that actual tweet information is not being stored. Just think about it, that earlier example that I told you about Lady Gaga, right? Just think that there were millions of followers of Lady Gaga. So I can't, replicate a single tweet into million copies. All I want to do is I just will keep the tweet ID in my Redis. And once that particular user comes online for whom this particular timeline is, that particular user, that particular tweet will be fetched from the database based on its tweet ID. Okay. And then the timeline service kicks in, which again does that reordering of stuff, which we talked about for Facebook. For Twitter, it happens on some different basis. Okay. But I don't want to go into that because we have kind of discussed on those lines when we were discussing the Facebook example. That is when the timeline service kicks in, reorders all the various tweets that you are supposed to see when you come online based on some relevancy score, and you see your timeline. The next very important thing which happens with Twitter is the search functionality with Twitter. Twitter is, yes, used for posting tweets, but the other thing which it is being used for very, very extensively is the search functionality of it. The hashtags, right? This century is a lot about hashtags. This decade is a lot about hashtags, where whenever we have to search for a particular information, we search for that hashtag on Twitter. All right. And we see all the tweets related to that hashtag very quickly on our search timeline. Okay. Again, what is happening is that whenever you make a query, or whenever you tweet, actually, it starts again from when a person tweets. Whenever a person tweets, tokenization happens. So whatever all the relevant keywords are present in that tweet, they are being tokenized, and they are being indexed into a database. All right. So basically, if let's say somebody is posting about, President Obama, then President and President Obama is are the three important tokens present in that tweet. All right. Similarly, other things like, if somebody is posting about a city, or if somebody is posting about a political figure, or if somebody is posting about an object. So all these are examples of what we call as tokens. So basically, we do a tokenization, and for each token, so let's say for Obama, if there are, a million tweet which came in the last one day, all those tweets. So if somebody searches for Obama, the reverse indexing happens, and we fetch all those tweets which mentioned Obama into it. All right. So basically, all of this is possible through tokenization that we are doing when somebody is posting a tweet. So as soon as somebody posted a tweet, we tokenized the important keywords into it. We stored the indexing based on that, Obama is my key in my index, and let's say these are all the tweets which mentions Obama. Okay, so when somebody searches for Obama, you go and you see all those tweets. Okay. And again, then what happens is the search query population, which is, again, the relevancy of each tweet. So let's say for Obama, now you have 1 million tweets, which you have to show to the user, but then you have to categorize into what are the top tweets versus what are the latest tweets, or what are the tweets with which a lot of interaction happens, and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So that is again search query population. So this was about, some of the big tech things that we wanted to discuss, which we kind of ignore in our day-to-day usage. And just to give you a glimpse of, what kind of scale are we dealing with. Okay. I just want to very quickly talk about, a full stack developer's life whenever a full stack developer is part of creating a web application, and that web application is being served to millions of users across the globe. And that is when we attach the term scaling to the web application. How do we scale the web applications? What are the important factors that we have to keep in mind while scaling web applications? Okay. So the first thing is obviously performance. And when we say performance, we first of all, we mean the response time. Okay. As I was talking to you earlier, that a response time. So let's say, if Facebook feed population takes 5 minutes, you will be, really irritated with it that, I've opened up Facebook. It's taking 5 minutes to get my feed. Or let's say, even if it is taking a minute to get you your feed, that becomes really, really irritating for you, right? So response time is the most important factor that, it should not happen that response type of your service or of your product or of your feature is too high, that it does not really do well with the users. Okay. The second thing which we talk about when we talk about performance is scalability. Okay. uh, as I told you, to give you an example of scalability, just think about something like Amazon or a Myntra. Just think about the contrast in the traffic to these websites or to these apps uh, on a sale day versus on a very on any other regular day. Okay. So like Myntra and Amazons, they keep on posting figures about how many orders were being placed in that 3-day sale period, or how many people, actually new people, joined, or how many people searched for how many products. So basically their service is getting used a lot during these times. Okay. Similarly, when we talk about Netflix, it is being used a lot during night time, not so much during the daytime. So all these kind of things happens, and whenever this thing happens, you can't just say that I have made Netflix to be only viewed during the daytime, because on night time the traffic is so much that we can't handle it. Okay. And that is where scalability becomes a question, that your application should be so much scalable that it does not stop serving whatever kind of traffic comes to it. Okay. And when we say scalability, we talk about vertical versus horizontal scalability. Very quickly, vertical scalability means improving or something within a machine, adding more CPU power to a particular machine. And horizontal scaling means adding more machines in simple. Okay. Then the next thing we want to talk about is a scalable architecture. Okay. What do we mean by a scalable architecture? So basically, as you might have heard that, nowadays there's it's a microservices are in trends, but there's a reason why they are in trends. Why? Because whenever you create a product, whenever you create a feature, whatever it is, there are lots of services which are working in the background. What we mean by services is that instead of creating one monolithic product, we divided various things into parts which were independent of each other. Okay. Now you already know one division, which is a front end and a back end and a database. Okay. That's the very basic division that we do ideally. Like we keep the back end and the database separate because database is stateful versus the back end is stateless, right? Things like that. But then even within the backend, one is a logging service which is logging what users are doing. Other is a service which is checking that if a user is an authenticated user or not. Other might be some big data service in the backend which is kind of ingesting the data, doing some filtration on top of that data. All these services which can run independently should run independently, so that you can scale those services if and when required on the go, and you don't have to scale the entire application, okay, to do that. So that is what we mean by scalable architecture. The other thing which we really should worry about is database scaling. Okay. So today you have 100 users in your applications, tomorrow 1 million users are there. What will happen to your indexes? How will your tables react? How fast will it be do uh, how fast will you be able to do CRUD operations on your database at that point of time, right? The other thing is database splitting, that when the database starts becoming humongous, how do you split your database across distributed machines, across distributed storage, such that you are able to still serve the user. And two important things come into picture, which is partitioning and sharding. All right. Then the next thing is the architecture bottlenecks, that we should really think about various bottlenecks, what all different bottlenecks can be there to in our architecture. And the last thing is that is my application CPU intensive versus IO intensive? CPU intensive means it's doing a lot of processing for each and every request that is coming in. IO intensive means that it is just reading and writing to something. Okay. So in a very small glimpse, these are the important factors which we should discuss or should think about when we think about taking our application out of our laptops. Okay. So in a very short, I have tried to cover up some aspects of how do we build, or what are the kinds of things that we see in big tech. All right. So yeah, it's open for Q&A. I'm sorry, Medha, it took so long. Uh, Yeah, so let's do the Q&A.
No worries. Thank you so much for covering it in such depth, Nishant, and three big applications, three big case studies that you took. Thank you for covering it so beautifully, and I hope the viewers agree with me saying that you covered it at great depth. Uh, just before I pick up questions, very quickly for all of you who attended, thank you so much for taking time out and want to just understand from you how you found the session, what you'd like us to improve on, and if you'd like to keep receiving communication from us. We do have 10 more minutes to pick questions up. I see two questions in the Q&A box. This session was brought to you by Upgrad, which is an online higher education upskilling platform, or I would call it, because we help you give 360-degree support on your careers, where we help you transition or accelerate your careers in emerging technology, which is brimming with great job opportunities. And if you go up on Google, just try to find out how do you deconstruct big tech, I'm sure you'll get 100,000 responses on Google search, right? But not in the way Nishant would explain it to you. So what we bring with us is a host of such amazing experts from all across the globe who help you with understand concepts in much simpler fashion and bring the right industry insights from straight from workplaces where you'd like to work at. And imagine doing your engineering degree, right? And how much of it would we be using in our day-to-day life, right? Very less. So what we provide is a degree which is very industry relevant, which you can go on and straight away apply at your workplaces. All right. That said, I'd like to pick up questions now. There's one attendee who's saying that he's a biology graduate and he's interested in coding. How can he start? I think you covered in great detail on what are the applications, but what about, where does a person with a non-technical background start?
So basically, first thing which I want to make people aware of is that nowadays these boundaries are really getting shattered day by day. We see people coming from all sorts of backgrounds into software industry, and the huge fact of why it is happening is because of such upskilling mediums like Upgrad, where people can really, like, if somebody has even done computer science but they didn't really paid much attention during their 3 or 4 years of course, still they can go ahead, subscribe to really great courses that are there on platform like Upgrad, and just upskill themselves. And because that is what is that is what is matters today. You'll be forced or you'll be subjected to do some interview questions, and if you do them, you are through. If you don't do them, you are not through. So all those questions or doubts about not belonging to this particular background, or not belonging from a tier 1 college, maybe, like, all these different kinds of questions keep on propping up. But those things are getting shattered now in software industry, at least. So what I would suggest is go do some course which you feel is relevant to you. Upskill yourselves, and try to do some cool projects as part of that course, and you'll really feel confident and be able to crack interviews and land a job in software industry.
Thanks so much, Nishant. And as you mentioned, Brad does have career coaches as a part of the course that you take. Essentially, from clearing that CV, that resume, review at the ATS, at the first step where companies screen candidates, to the point of preparation for interviews, with mock interviews, with one-to-one career counseling sessions. Upgrad definitely helps you throughout the process, and which is why we call ourselves your career partners. So feel free to look up upgrad.com and find any course that interests you and where you would like to be working, and would be happy to take it from there. Do write to us at admissions@upgrad.com, and we'll get you in touch with our admissions counselors. Chetal is saying, please send the recording. Sure, Chetal, the link that you used to join the session, you can use the same link to access the recording. Rajesh is saying he wanted to understand Redis cache usage scenario. Can this be in between database and web app? In some cases, apps and database might communicate over a WAN, high latency. In such scenarios, can Redis help?
So basically, first of all, to give a bit background about Redis, Redis is a key value store, as I told earlier. What do we mean by key value store is that when we want to fetch some information very quickly based on a particular key, which is in this case was a user ID maybe of a user who is trying to access his timeline, right? So user ID is that key, and then all the tweets which have to appear on the timeline of that particular user are is stored as part of value. Okay, so Redis is used in such scenarios, and we call Redis not just Redis but Redis cache in general. Why? Because accessing is very really fast when we talk about Redis versus in comparison to a database. Okay, so first thing is that coming to the second question, which is like can it be used between a web app and a database? It is actually used between a web app and a database, where you first go to your cache, you see if you get an answer from your cache. If you don't get an answer from a cache, you go to your database and then do things on top of it. Okay, so there are a lot of scenarios in life where you don't have you should not go to a database to fetch answers to a particular question. So for example, let's say you want to search which all Taj hotels are present in Mumbai. Okay, that is an answer which is really static. It won't change in an hourly basis or on a daily basis. The number of Taj hotels in Mumbai will remain the same. I mean, yeah, you have to keep on validating it, but that is something for which you should not go to your database and should save it in your Redis. Okay, then or in your cache. Okay, so 90% of the traffic or 90% of the things for which we access our databases can be solved through caches. I mean, this is a very like this term of this figure of 90% has come up from a lot of background research that has gone through over decades of software engineering, and you should do that. And the other process to caches, when we talk about caches, is invalidating a cache, which is when you say that the information that is in cache is stale now and I want to refetch this information. So like, let's say in this particular example of how many Taj hotels are there in Mumbai, you can actually keep on invalidating it every week, so that you have the latest information always available with you. Okay, so that was about Redis and cache. Hope I answered your question.
Thanks so much, Nishant. Any more questions? I don't see any of them in the Q&A box or the chat box. I've given you our email ID on the chat, so do feel free to shoot us emails, and I'll still wait for a couple more minutes to for us to ask Nishant any questions if we have. But Nishant, congratulations! A lot of people really found this session interesting. The poll definitely says that you covered the topic in the easiest way possible. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
All right. One more question from Rajesh. How does Redis versus Memcache?
So basically,
do you call it Memcache or MEM?
Memcache, yeah. So basically, Memcache, the first basic difference is of a key value store versus a blob. So whatever we store in a Memcache is in blob format. Okay, it's not in a key value format. So when you store it in a blob format, you have to fetch that blob and analyze that blob to be able to add some information to that blob. Whereas Redis is a key value store where you directly fetch something based on the key and then just do like add maybe. So basically, let's say a new tweet came in for a and this tweet has to be shown to a particular user. You just fetch that user's timeline from the Redis based on that user ID. Just append this one more tweet to that timeline and you are done with it. And that is why Twitter uses Redis nowadays. It also used to use Memcache like in 2008 or 9s, and that was a disaster for Twitter because Memcache is not a key value store. It's like it stores information in a blob. So basically, whatever is being stored, it does not matter to Memcache what kind of information that is. It's just a piece of text or information that is being stored.
Interesting. That's new learning for me as well. But I think maybe asking on behalf of a few people, and I think we've been asked this question even in the past when we've done webinars like these. Do you always have to be, up to date with relevant softwares, tools, because there's so many that keep coming up, or is it that you should really focus on your foundations? And essentially the latter is what we do cover in our courses. Definitely stress on that and then build on with newer tools and technologies.
So yeah, even I would incline to the later, which is like, you should always keep your foundations strong, because the new technologies, new kind of things keep on coming up every day. Like especially if you talk in AI ML world or in blockchain world, where the technology is still in nascent stages, these things kind of keep cropping up daily, and if you kind of keep try to keep pace with it, you won't be able to do that. Versus if your basics are strong, if your fundamentals are strong, if you can realize that a memcache is not working for me because the information is stored in this way, I need something where I can just fetch information based on a particular key, or let's say things like that. So that really comes from your strong computer science fundamentals at the end of the day, and that is what you should focus upon. And once you realize some problem with the thing that you have done, like the way that you have done a thing, and you just Google about it, that what's an alternate to memcache, because it's not you alone who might be facing that issue in the tech world. The community is the biggest thing about the tech world, the Stack Overflow or the Google. And that's why I keep on saying that you are 80% engineer if you know how to Google or Stack Overflow. So basically, the community support is the biggest thing when we talk about anything tech. You can take that community support to figure out that, okay, memcache is not the answer for me, maybe Redis is the answer for me. But for that, you should be able to realize what is the problem with memcache and why is memcache not helping me, and that comes from your fundamentals.
That's interesting. Any such communities you would recommend?
I mean, I just Google and Stack Overflow, that's all, and they have helped me so far.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, there's dozens of subreddits that people can follow. Yeah. All right, I think I'll take this as the last question. Jay is asking, in programming of any application, what thing decides the response time of the application? Interesting question.
So basically, it is a very lengthy question to answer, because everything decides actually the response time, like how you have coded. To give you a very small example, like students kind of run away when we talk about time complexities in data structures and algorithms, because they find it really, really, they're not able to understand it for some reason. That what is order n cube complexity versus order log n complexity when we talk about any operation like a search operation. And this is also one of the reasons which contributes to the response time. So if you are doing a search in a brute force manner where it's taking order n cube time complexity, obviously your application's response time will be higher, versus if you have implemented a searching algorithm which is taking order log n time complexity. And this is one of the aspects of response time. There are millions of aspects to the response time. I can like go on and on about it for maybe 2 hours. But one thing which I really tell people, and which has really helped me as well, is that whenever I create something or code something, I really put a timer at the start of my code and put a timer at the end of my code to see how much time my code is taking to process something. And once I figure out that thing, and let's say it is taking too much time, I dig deeper, put those timers at various parts in my code, to figure out now what is that part of the code which is taking more time. And that is, I believe, something that someone should do when, always do, whether, you are concerned about the response time or not.
Does it also depend on the language that you're using?
It does a lot of times, like, there's nothing against any particular language, but yeah, obviously people switch to a stack which is based out of C++ or Java when they have to really, really do things at scale, because even 2 milliseconds or 3 milliseconds matter over there. Versus, people always start from a stack like Python or a Node.js or a Ruby on Rails when they're starting up with an application, and that is true for everything like Instagram or Twitter, everything. So that does depend on the language as well, because the tech stack on top of it, because the more low level a language is, the more command you have on kind of, playing around with it, where you can do something to actually reduce the response time, versus a Python where you just have a sorting method in your hand which you have to use. You can't do much in that. So in that sense, yes, language does play a part as well.
Great, that's great to know. Jay is asking, how can I become a successful software engineer? Jay, I think Nishant already said that it's so much about community support. So the more you contribute to the community, the more the community recognizes you, and the more if that's what you define as success. Everybody has different definitions of success, but yeah, do be an active contributor to communities. And how do you be one if you have the right understanding of how to contribute, right? So maybe start with an upgrad course, see where that takes you, and do keep contributing. All right, that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you, Nishant, so much, and thanks to everybody. Apologies if we couldn't take any question. Do write to us at admissions@upgrad.com, and would be happy to take it from there. Thank you so much for your time. Have a good day. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you all.